But let's talk about Biden's trip to Ukraine really quickly. I mean, this was to me a desperate PR stunt, and I'd like to know what you think is behind Biden's decision. Here he is with Zelensky, and basically a siren incoming. They're bombing Kiev with pallets of cash stolen from U.S. taxpayers, apparently. And they're surrounded with camera people. The whole area of the city sealed off. There's no one there.
I mean, this is so funny. Right when Biden and Zelensky pop out of that building, church, whatever it is, an air siren goes off as if they're under some kind of threat. And unfortunately, though, their ruse, their photo op was blown up by none other than CNN, which pointed out the inconvenient fact that Kiev hasn't even had air sirens go off at all in the last recent days until the very moment when Biden and Zelensky walked out.
I've been here for the past 5 days. I have not heard any explosions. I have not heard any air sirens until about half an hour ago, right when President Biden was in the center of Kiev, as Clarissa was just mentioning. I've been here for the past 5 days. I have not heard.
So how cynical is that? How cynical is that? You're in a war zone. This country is being invaded, and you go there and you use your visit to pretend as if you're in some kind of threat. Like you're sort of making fun of Ukrainians who actually are living in fear of being bombed by using the air siren as a photo op. And of course, to making it all the more ridiculous, this idea that Biden and Zelensky are being daring and, using an air siren to dramatize the situation is the fact, which got acknowledged somewhere in U.S. media, but not nearly enough, that the U.S. told Russia ahead of time that Biden was visiting. So there are all these stories about a cloak and dagger covert Biden mission, and all these cable news pundits like falling over themselves to praise him for daring to go into a combat zone. And we have some of those clips. We can play them.
Well, let's look at the propaganda first, how this was sold. We got the BBC. This whole report is basically, it might as well have been written by the White House. Biden in Ukraine, how the president's surprise visit was kept a secret. And, despite widespread speculation among the press corps that Mr. Biden might be planning a trip to Ukraine while he's in Poland, the visit still took everyone completely by surprise, right? The sight of him appearing beside Volodymyr Zelensky in the heart of Kiev and under the sound of air raid sirens makes a louder statement than anything he can say in a speech in Poland. That's the BBC's own writing. It reads like his own press secretary wrote, well, hey, here is someone who works for his press secretary, White House Communications Director Kate Bedingfield. It was risky and should leave no doubt in anyone's mind that Joe Biden is a leader who takes commitment seriously. But in reality, I mean, the U.S. told Russia, and what was Russia going to do? Were they actually going to shoot Biden down? No.
Well, that's the other funny thing is Biden didn't even fly right into Ukraine. He flew first to Germany. Okay, stopped in Germany. Then they flew over to Poland. And then they took a car from the Polish airport to the border. And then at the border, they took a train. So this idea of this like daring flight into the war zone, which some people like Claire McCaskill spread, that Biden flew in, covertly, trying to evade the Russians into the war zone. It's a complete fantasy. And what happened was,
Hillary spread a similar lie about entering. I think it was Bosnia.
Yeah,
where she flew. That they had to do this spiraling emergency landing to the onto the tarmac. It was just completely made up. But this is even more gross deception. Here's a AP correspondent on how Biden actually pulled off his secret visit.
It's not unusual for presidents to visit war zones, certainly where Americans are combatants. But the critical difference between those trips and going to Kiev is that the U.S. isn't a belligerent in Kiev, in Ukraine. It doesn't control the airspace. It doesn't have a very large troop presence. President Biden spent about 23 hours on the ground on Ukrainian soil. That included about 5 hours in Kiev and time on the train there and back. So the logistics of pulling something like this off safely were incredibly complex. Part of what allowed the president to do this is the notification to Russia, so
The
that they wouldn't
notification
want to
to
trigger
Russia.
any sort of miscalculation that could start off essentially nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia, the two nuclear armed powers. But also U.S.
There it is.
surveillance planes flying along the Polish border.
So yeah, they notified Russia. Steely-eyed Biden.
You know, by the way, a funny point here for haters of Seymour Hersh. These OSINT people, see if they can find Biden's plane flying into Germany. See if they can find a record of that. They can't, because the transmitters were turned off. And so all these OSINT people, when they try to, like, you know, dismiss Hersh's reporting, and they say, oh, look, we can't find that surveillance, like the flight that set off the sonic boom that set off the bombs. We can't find that in our OSINT maps. That means there was no flight. That means the Hersh is wrong. Well, try to find the flight of Biden flying into Germany. It's not there, because they turned off the transmitter. Because a newsflash for Bellingcat and other OSINT people, intelligence people think of this kind of stuff, and they don't want their activities to be able to be picked up in open source. So that's why they hide it. And a similar thing happened, I think, with the bombing of the Nord Stream 2. It's just something that they overlooked, among many other things.
Yeah. Well, they'll do better following Elon Musk's jet, I guess.
Yeah. But in terms of why Biden went to Kiev, I think, you know, obviously a main reason is just for U.S. domestic consumption, and for all of his media stenographers to praise him as this daring hero who went into a combat zone to shore up support for the proxy war at home 1 year into the war, with no appetite at all in Washington for any kind of diplomacy. They want to keep it going. And also because I think Zelensky probably needs the support too, because inside the Ukrainian government, we're talking about one of the most corrupt governments in the world. There's all kinds of infighting. There are people fighting over the loot, like fighting over the bounty that they're getting from the international community, especially the U.S. And Zelensky might be facing some challenges from within on that. And Biden going to meet him personally, I think, is a show of support. Like it's an endorsement that, like, you know, him putting his arm around Zelensky is a sign that the Godfather still backs this capo inside Kiev. So I think that's also what this was about.
Yeah, he's a capo in more ways than one. I mean, being a Jew at the top of a regime that backs literal Nazis makes him a different kind of capo.
That's true.
Well, Biden's visit also was accompanied by a desperate attempt to sell Americans on his bravery and on the importance of doing this while the country was suffering. Here's this is Douglas Brinkley on Biden's Kiev photo op.
Our resident historian,
a resident court historian,
like either the presidential visit,
like always this guy or Michael Betchloss.
Oh yeah.
The blow dried hair historians. Like real historians look they're kind of crazy, and like, you know, they're chain smokers and they're wearing like tattered tweed jackets. These guys, they always have crisp suits and their hair is perfectly blow dried. They look like wax museum sculptures.
To war zones. Presidents have visited Iraq and Afghanistan in recent years, but those were U.S. wars. This is a Ukrainian war.
By the way, that's Jim Sciutto, not to be confused with prosciutto. And he is a former State Department employee. He actually dropped his job at CNN to go work in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing under Obama, and was the assistant chief of staff. He was the chief of staff to Gary Locke, who was the U.S. ambassador there. That's a pretty strategically significant embassy. So you basically have a guy who's repping for the State Department in the CNN anchor chair. In case it wasn't obvious.
That should be in his chyron when CNN identifies him. It should say former State Department propagandist. But you know what's also funny about Jim Sciutto is when Russia invaded, he gave this like dramatic monologue from Ukraine, because remember, like back then, every Western correspondent flooded to Ukraine, and he was among them. And he gave this dramatic monologue where he said, before Russia invaded, Ukraine was at peace. It wasn't at war with anyone. There's nothing going on. It's like, did you not know that there's been a civil war going on there for 8 years that like the U.S. was majorly involved in as well? And that was a major reason why Russia invaded, because actually Ukraine was escalating its assaults on eastern Ukraine, where ethnic Russians are, and was threatening to basically wipe it out. Like, did you not know that? Or are you just forgetting it? I don't know what these people, whether they're lying or they just don't even know the basic facts of the issues they're reporting on.
I mean, he's one of the most aggressive propagandists. He gets unfettered access to the national security state. John Brennan, by the way, former CIA director, is he's an MSNBC contributor, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
He's referred to merely as a national security contributor. They never note that it speaks for Langley when he appears on MSNBC. Here's let's continue.
No U.S. military presence on the ground. How
hagiography.
It's extremely significant. The United States is wedded more to the Ukraine than ever before. I go back to history and think of Roosevelt and Churchill when FDR had to sneak off in the dead of night, even had a body double at one point to first meet Winston Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland. And then, of course, you had all those World War II meetings between Churchill. It's worth
also had to sneak off to meet his mistress.
Mentioning Churchill, because Zelensky has been called the Churchill of our generation, and Biden going there today, I think it's going to be a moment for the history books. It's like when John F. Kennedy
he's a Churchill in that he uses poison gas on his enemies.
Went to Berlin in 1961 and gave a speech at the height of the Cold War. Ukraine is the new Berlin. It's the rally point for NATO and the Western allies. And I think Biden did something really heroic.
Well, there you have it. It was heroic. No, I don't know what normal people agree with that, but there we could go through so many clips of media praise, mainly on CNN.
It's just a spectacle. It
just goes on and on. Here's this is Claire McCaskill, who's the former right-wing Democratic governor of Missouri, and she's like, the voice of she's the true voice of MSNBC now, the right wing of the Democratic Party.
This one's really funny.
Wallace, former George W. Bush flack. They always have like the true embodiment of the establishment when they bring 4 people on MSNBC.
I'm not sure that it was all pre-planned, but it has certainly all been well executed. His back and forth with the nuttiest of the nutty Republicans at the State of the Union, pulling off this trip and these images of defenders of democracy.
She always sounds kind of drunk.
From 2 very different generations, walking shoulder to shoulder in Kiev. What do you make of this?
Well, it's very important because in the back of everyone's mind, there's always a contrast. There's always a comparison. And this kind of dovetails with what you talked about earlier, that when the president runs for re-election, it is not a referendum on him. It is a choice. And if you compare and contrast Donald Trump was afraid to go to Afghanistan. And Afghanistan.
Donald Trump was afraid to stay upstairs during the Black Lives Matter protests.
Exactly. I mean, very little courage. And, having flown into war zones a number of times, both Iraq and Afghanistan, as a member of the Senate, was there moments that it was weird? Yes, but there was always a sense that you're surrounded by the United States military. You're enveloped by the United States military. When that Air Force...
Kind of like the people of Afghanistan or the people in Ukraine. They're enveloped by the U.S. military. Isn't that reassuring?
One flew over the border into Ukraine. Everybody knows it was just that airplane.
Sorry, I said she was governor. She was senator.
From the United States in that airspace. And that took courage. And that courage is a very important.
Yeah.
That's a lie. She doesn't realize this, but the plane did not fly into Ukraine.
Yeah.
It flew into Germany. Then he flew again to Poland, and then from there, Poland took a car to the Polish border with Ukraine, and then took a train. So she's making up this idea that he flew in on this risky flight into this Ukraine war zone.
It's completely made up. I just want to point out something else here, which is interesting about MSNBC. You see the 4 people you have. This is like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. You have the Democratic Party centrist hack. Then you have the media guy to her left. I think that's like John Heilman, who's complete centrist regime lackey. Then you have the spook, who represents the deep state. I think that's Jeremy Bash, who is a former spokesperson for the CIA and the Pentagon.
You know, Max, I don't think that's Jeremy Bash.
That's not Jeremy Bash?
I don't
Okay.
think that is, no. I don't.
Kind of looks like him.
It looks like him. I think that guy just might be a correspondent.
Okay, that's just the guy. Yeah, that's a correspondent. All right, my bad. Well, they often have the spook, and then they have Nicole Wallace, who's, you know, the Bush Republican.
Yeah.
So this is really the regime right there.
Yeah.
And that regime includes Pompeo, and Nikki Haley. So that's what they're lining up against Trump.
Yeah.
Anyway, remarkable stuff. I mean, they just are straight up lying about Biden's trip. The air raid siren was fake. The surprise was fake. The landing in Kiev was fake. The whole thing was a gigantic stunt. And, you know, if he had just taken a car to East Palestine, Ohio, I think he'd be slightly more well-liked by Americans, but that's not who he's catering to. It's like the European leaders who are willing to cut off energy to their own people, to the poor and working people of Europe in order to satisfy NATO. They're not representing any constituents.